So we're talking today about the chapter on globalization, climate change, and human health by the late Tony McMichael. And I'm talking today to Ari Bernstein, who's the Associate Director of the Center for Global Environment and Health at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. He's an instructor in pediatrics at Boston Children's Hospital and has a particular interest in climate change, biodiversity, and human health. Ari, thanks for being here.
Pleasure, David.
So Tony McMichael, in his review, labeled the current era as the Anthropocene. What did he mean by that?
Yeah. Tony McMichael, who's a public health epidemiologist, looked at the consequences of the human influence on Earth as a public health issue. And so this idea of the Anthropocene is sort of looking at all the natural cycles on Earth. So we have a water cycle, we have a carbon cycle, we have a nitrogen cycle, and we also have biodiversity. We have life on Earth. And historically, those things operated on natural principles. So all these things were influenced by the laws of nature. But what defines the Anthropocene is we now see human actions, for example, being the largest influence on the nitrogen cycle. We're dramatically changing the carbon cycle to release the fossil fuels. We've profoundly transformed the living world. And so that is the hallmark of the Anthropocene, which is a fundamentally different state of affairs for life on Earth, including ours, than has ever happened. There's never been a point in the Earth's history where a single species has so profoundly influenced all of these aspects of Earth.
So humans have been changing the environment for at least thousands of years.
Yes.
Deforestation, agriculture, etc. How much of this is changes in technology and our capacity to change our environment versus changes in the sheer size of the population?
That's a great question. It's both. Certainly the population is an issue in terms of the demand for natural resources. At the same time, we know that people living in developed countries exact a much larger share of resource consumption, orders of magnitude in some cases, than people in developing countries. And you can't solve any of the overconsumption problems by simply changing the population structure or by consumption. You actually have to do both. I think that is often in these debates about what one could do to affect human influence lost, in that we can't just do one or the other. We have to actually think about both.
So populations are sort of plateaued in developed countries, still expanding in some less developed countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Can we sort of disaggregate the influence of increasing population, where it's increasing, from the adoption of technologies in those countries that alter the environment more rapidly?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you look at, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, where population growth is faster than replacement, certainly in most countries, that is in part due to the availability of food that is made possible by the Green Revolution, other agricultural advancements. At the same time, we know that one of the best ways to, maintain a population growth rate that is not unsustainable is to educate women, provide for economic opportunity, and do these things, which are also sort of technological in some ways. And so I think they really do have to be thought of together, both for better or worse.
So one of the hopes we have is that there are positive aspects to globalization. You mentioned education and some aspects of healthcare, longevity, decreasing population size by decreasing infant mortality. Can you talk a little bit about some of the positive aspects of globalization before we talk about the negatives?
Sure. There's no question, for instance, that the availability of food at a global level is a major buffer against famine. It's not to say that we don't have about 1 billion people who don't have enough food, or that there's major nutrient deficiencies, but there's certainly a buffer against the price of food when it's distributed around the world and we're able to provide it in a relatively inexpensive way. So too with technology. You think about cell phones, the classic example in sub-Saharan Africa, where there are very few places where there are so-called landlines. Almost everyone has a cellular phone, and that has advanced all kinds of great things in terms of economies and communication and so forth. I think there's the real potential, and this is very much, I think, a matter of debate, but I think it's a prospect that in terms of the flow of information, and be it news, but also knowledge, right? So this very course would not be possible in an era in which we didn't have the internet, we didn't have people trying to build internet infrastructure into relatively remote, poor communities, and that knowledge can be extremely empowering and provide leapfrogs to people accessing markets in the same way that cell phones provided access to communication. I think the list goes on and on. And I think, as your question points out, with any human innovation, there's always an upside and a downside. And we have an obligation to always think critically about every time we see the upside to make sure we understand the full scope of what the consequences of our actions are. And we're seeing a lot of that with some of the innovations that have been some of the most important regarding development around the world today.
So on a regional level, we see impacts of deforestation leading to increases in flooding and local disasters. But in the last decades, we've really understood more about the globe as an interconnected system. Some people talk about climate change, some people talk about global warming. Do you prefer one or other of those terms?
Yeah, I prefer climate change only because designating the problem as global warming, I think, doesn't speak to the breadth of concerns that we face. I mean, certainly warming is a part of it, but the changes to the water cycle, the floods and droughts, that's not really warming. That's, is there going to be a drought, is there going to be flooding? Sea level rise. Yep. Certainly when oceans warm, they get bigger and that causes sea level rise, but there are other contributors to that as well, melting of ice. So I think climate change is a better term for that reason. And it's also, I think, important to recognize that warming that is happening is not happening equally everywhere. The North Pole is warming much faster than near the equator. Even sea level rise is not equal across the globe. So I think climate change speaks to the instability of the climate system as a whole, whereas global warming sort of focuses on one narrow aspect of it.
So we think about this as a global interconnected system, but you're saying that all of the parameters don't move in the same direction evenly around the world. Are there places that are predicted to get hotter, and are there places that might get cooler?
There certainly are places that have gotten cooler since greenhouse gases have been pushed into the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels and deforestation. However, looking forward to 2100, will there be places that are still yet cooler? Maybe, but there's no question the vast majority of the Earth's surface is going to be warmer. I think it's important to recognize, though, and to your point, that what happens in one place is not indicative of what will happen somewhere else, with warming, with sea level rise, with precipitation patterns. And I think it's important for people to recognize, as they think about health, that certain places may see much more sea level rise than others, and flooding as a result in coastal areas may be much more likely. And this is true in the United States, where the eastern seaboard sea level is rising much faster than the west coast. Floods and droughts, the maxim that's been put out there is that places that are already wet, you can think about, subtropical rainforests, are probably going to see a little more precipitation on average overall, and places that are already dry are going to see a little less on average as warming proceeds. But the bigger signal is that there will be more intense precipitation, meaning that whatever the amount of rainfall is, which might have come in smaller buckets across the year, is now going to be more concentrated. And so we've seen that already, and the models show us that that's going to continue to happen. We've seen it particularly in New England, where we're sitting right now since the Industrial Revolution. And so I think, again, the point is that, yes, there are these globally averaged numbers, but in any one place, it's important to remember that climate change can be quite different in how it manifests in different parts of the world.